today. We have 1 hour to explore democracy. It's a vast topic, the new paths of democracy, and it's a very topical issue, at least in France. I'd like to introduce our speakers and the panel, and then we'll begin the debate. On my right, Chloé Morin. You were an advisor to the Prime Minister, and you work at EMSOS, and you have a company currently. Johanna Vertianen. You are the mayor of Helsinki. You're an economist in a preceding life. You're still an economist. Okay. Eliana Santos. You are Franco-Congolese. You define yourself as a civic entrepreneur. And you have created an incubator of public policy, Je m'engage pour l'Afrique. Mr. Abdel Ali, you're a journalist, a politician, editor-in-chief of Al Bawaba newspaper. You're a specialist in the Islamist movement, and you also have given great thought to the link between democracy and religion. And Marie-Lise Léon, you are the new president of the CFDT. You had some troubled beginnings at the CFDT with the reform of the retirement scheme in France, and you can talk about social democracy. And Vincent Pons, who is the moderator and economist, a professor at Harvard in the US, best young economist this year, and you specialized in voting, abstention, and why people abstain. You'll be introducing the debate, and then we'll hear from our speakers. Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you to you all for having joined us for this session on the new paths of democracy. We called this session in this manner because democracy currently has reached a sort of dead end. Historically speaking, we're at a point in time where after 2 centuries and 2 waves when countries have become democracies, now democracy is receding. Look at countries like Turkey, Hungary, India, where rights are thwarted. Look at the elections in Turkey. The opponent to Erdogan had 50% less TV time than Erdogan, and democratic institutions have become weakened. What's even more preoccupying is that when you look at the oldest democracies in the world, the most robust ones, like in France and the US, we also note a certain number of weaknesses, the drop in the number of people voting, mistrust of elected people, the rise in populist votes, and the role of the social movements. So it's not just a political issue. When democracy is not doing well, it's the whole of growth or economic activity that's threatened. The link between democracy and economic activity is obvious. When you're in a context where there's a lot of mistrust of elected people, it's very difficult for these elected people to implement reforms and have a serene debate on policies. When there's a risk of a populist party, an extremist party being voted in, and this can lead to something like Brexit or what have you. The problem is that we're at a loss in the face of these threats and these growing cracks in democracy. The trends I've noted, the drop in participation, these trends date back to the 70s, in fact. These are phenomena that don't just affect France, but most democracies in the Western world. We sense that they're are deep-seated causes to these trends. And democracy, per se, is an exercise where you delegate decision-making power to tens of thousands of citizens. So it's difficult to identify remedies. Yet we're going to focus on remedies here at this roundtable discussion. What are the possible remedies so that democracy can do better? Can we hope that the solution is in the offing? Do we need new public policies? Is it elected people who should reinforce democracy? Should it be companies that do so? So I'd like to open the debate, and we're awaiting concrete answers from each and every one of you to these various questions. Marie-Lise Léon will be our first speaker. She is a trade unionist at the CFDT. How do you view this social democracy, which seems to be sorely lacking over the last few months? How can one improve it? What can one do to go further currently? Well, that's a vast program. Hello, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm not an economist, and I hope that you won't hold that against me. I believe that it's good to have different views. Indeed, that's one of the best ways to find the right answer to a problem. I like this idea of the new paths of democracy in the title. There's no miraculous remedy. I think we have to put together all sorts of solutions that we need to think about as a group. And before answering the question, I would like to reaffirm here the following. Democracy is important for a trade unionist and for trade unionism in general. There can be no emancipation, solidarity, equality without democracy. And I can bear witness to this. Indeed, it is necessary to defend a democracy when cooperating with militants from other trade unions, be they in Europe or abroad. When democracy becomes weak, and becomes fragile or disappears, then trade unionism also disappears. And these two things are closely bound up together. I might give you a global answer to the question, and then I'll go into some details. My organization believes that democracy is less sick because of its institutions than the way the institutions actually work. I'll therefore focus on three remedies. And there is a demand that my organization applies to itself. I'm talking about the CFTD. The remedy is the following. We have to look at the frame of mind in terms of democracy. Democracy is not a daily exercise. It's a special frame of mind. You have to agree that there can be no democracy without comparing ideas, without holding a debate, without respecting the different players, and without looking for lasting compromises, which will make it possible to build or work for the general interest, the interest of society at large. So it's a general mindset. Of course, universal suffrage is not the same as absolute legitimacy. It is absolutely necessary to give legitimacy to decisions taken by politicians. When it comes to the frame of mind that I'm trying to describe, one has to recognize there are many different players. One has to accept counterpowers, checks and balances, the sharing of power on a national level, and in companies as well. And I'll talk about that later on. I also believe that over and beyond these ethics when it comes to power, there isn't just one democracy. There are different kinds of democracies. There are different players. There are numerous players who lend life to democracy, representative democracy, political democracy, social democracy. I think that everyone has a part to play. Everyone can be useful, and we have to think about the links between the individual players and all these kinds of democracies. One has to rethink these links. We truly need to take account. How can I put this, says the speaker? I think we often forget when discussing representative democracy, we often forget the millions of people who are represented by the players. And the players in any social democracy or trade union democracy, of course, one shouldn't talk about the organization, one should talk about the people one represents, the thousands of people one represents. I'm speaking on behalf of the workers I represent who voted for me. We also have 650 million members of the union. I've referred to the responsibility of the different players as well. I believe that democracy shouldn't stop at the doors of a company, the economic entities. You have to consider workers as a whole person, and you need to have places for expression and dialogue at work, at the workplace. That's also important in public administrations. We need to have good social dialogue, a proper economic, social, and environmental dialogue in all these strategic places, like administrations and companies. And people also talk about being able to talk openly at work. That was one of the things that was mentioned when reforming the pension scheme. Of course, things tend to focus on the 64-year age limit, but in the demonstrations, people were saying they want to get greater appreciation for the work done. They want to live better off their work. Thank you. Mr. Abdelhamid Ali, I think you have a lot of experience of fighting for democracy and human rights in a country where it's not always easy. You strongly defended religious minorities. So, democracy in Egypt, what are the solutions there?
Today, but unfortunately, I will speak by Arabic because I have to be very clear in this dangerous moment in France and in some areas in the world. شايف حد معاه سماعات.
Ouais, le problème c'est que
I hope you all have headsets so you can listen to what I'm going to say.
si vous pouviez amener des écouteurs pour les gens, voilà.
S'il vous plaît.
I'm sorry about this.
Ah bah d'accord, ok.
Ah, ممكن.
Ouais.
Very nice. Very good. Very good. Very good. Very good. Very good. Very good. سعيد جدا بالتواجد معاكم.
Très heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Merci.
يبدو ان اليوم سأسبح ضد التيار.
Il paraît aujourd'hui que je vais
I would like to say that I will take a different stance from many people. I'm not going to talk about democracy per se. I'm not going to talk about fragile democracy. Fragile democracy, in my view, I'm talking about my experience, which is a lengthy one. I have studied Islamist movements for a long time. We've seen that some democratic societies have created a certain confusion because they have enabled these movements to penetrate our societies and impose their views. In my view, that's the great danger facing Europe and democracy in Europe and in France in particular. We all noted a few weeks ago that there were very sad events. Why? Because there was a lack of respect of the values and principles which form the basis of democracy in our countries. I'm talking about freedom of expression and freedom of belief. The values of democracy, liberalism, and equality above all. I'm not talking about the Islamic religion as per se. I am a Muslim. I'm not talking about the Arabs as a nation. And I'm not talking about the immigrants in France, because the immigrants in France, well, France gives us freedom and equality. I'm talking about something that I want to draw your attention to. I've been studying these movements for over 40 years. I talked about the kidnapping of certain universities. We have people who steal the brains of these immigrants, and people are using a fragile democratic system in their country to transform it. And they turn these migrants' brains into puppets. We have already tried a number of solutions in our country. We often talked about the Arab Spring. This Arab Spring was never an experience designed to advance democracy in the country. It was a tactic which aims to destroy the country from within. I lived this time in detail. France nearly experienced the same thing just a few weeks ago. I saw with my very own eyes the terror of the French, men and women and children. Friends weren't able to leave home throughout this period because there was a true reign of terror. It wasn't a demonstration, what was happening. I can confirm this to you. We'll see what happens in a few years' time. Be it in France or in Europe, even worse things may happen in the future compared with what happened in the last 10 days. There are other events which are planned in order to kidnap these brains. For half a century, people have been hard at work at this, and politicians must be very careful. There should be restrictions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Elena Santos, you're Franco-Tongolese. You believe in democracy, you believe in citizens' participation, and particularly young Africans. You're quite positive. What, according to you, are the solutions? You said that you were a bit upset to see there aren't many places where young people can express themselves today, discuss things, and receive the requisite training. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon. As you said, I'm Franco-Togolese. This gives me an opportunity to view the two continents, these two geographical areas. I was born in Togo and I came to France for my studies. That's my background. For me, democracy is responsibility. It is also mobilization. What I mean is that we are all concerned. And if we're not happy, if things don't suit us, then I believe in the fact that it's up to us to do something about it. Young people, of course, young people today are faced with many challenges, climate change, the economy, and it's up to us to explore these new paths of democracy, just to quote the title of this meeting. We have the tools to do this, the will to do it. I'd just like to remind you of a few figures. In Africa today, 60% of the population is under the age of 25. In 30 years' time, by 2050, 35% of young people in the world will be African. And obviously, one can wonder how we can create this democratic space in Africa and also throughout the world. Just 3 points why I want to become deeply engaged. First of all, this distended link between institutions and citizens. The second reason for becoming engaged is that I noted a lot of energy and we need to turn this energy into concrete action. I'll answer the question put earlier on. I think in particular in Africa, we have to focus on young people. The Côte d'Ivoire, for example, today, focus a lot on young people in terms of employment, training. And I believe that it's very important today if each young person is to participate in the public debate. For me, that's the first point, which is of capital importance. We have to really place our bets on youth. Second point, which is dear to my heart, how can we reinvent democracy? I see all over the place new modes of action, new ways of becoming engaged for a given cause. One can support a coalition. Many people want to become engaged à la carte, in hybrid mode. And likewise, the idea is to find the requisite answers. Currently, Professor Achille Bembe launched the Foundation for Innovation for Democracy in Africa. This is an initiative supported by Africans for Africans. The idea is to train and provide financial support to these people who are so energetic in this area, multiply the number of areas for dialogue. In France, there are many people who come from the diaspora. We are dual nationals, and we have a role to play. We can teach the good practices that we find on one or other of the continents. And there's the last thing, which for me is a remedy and we need to work on. We have all these new technologies. There are good sides and bad sides to new technologies. You have fake news, for example. In Kenya, a few years ago, they managed to secure the elections through the blockchain. So these are innovations, and I believe we can draw inspiration from these good practices. So in sum, what I want to say is that we need to place our bets on youth, place our trust in youth. Another concrete example, for example, is that I believe in young public-private partnerships. I think we should delegate missions to young people so that You can tell me what you think about it so that they can create a local mission in their place where they live, for example. We need to create these spaces, these tools, where everyone can find his or her rightful place. There are many people who are engaged. Alexandre from Marseille, you, Ernest. We have lots and lots of people who are engaged on a daily basis. I'd like to congratulate all these young people. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Thank you. You said earlier on that it was complicated, Johanna Vartianin, for democracies and for welfare states. Given globalization and the circulation of populations, the strong waves of migration, democracy is deeply threatened across Europe. I wouldn't say it's deeply threatened, but it's true that there is a crisis. For a long time, economists, technocratic economists like me, for example, we thought that the Northern European system, with a strong market economy combined with a welfare state, high taxes, lots of public services, we thought that that would be sufficient. It would be the right solution. It's capitalism, granted, but the idea is to share the prosperity generated by the market economy. We've seen that perhaps this may not be sufficient, however, in recent years. A lot of the current problems can be traced back to the demographic challenge, in fact. The welfare states in the north of Europe were designed at a time where we didn't need to think about demographics. The workforce continued to increase over the years. We could keep creating new services, new benefits, and so on. Now, the demographics go in the opposite direction. So we need a lot of fiscal discipline. We need to welcome immigrants in order to fill labor shortages. And that has created a lot of political malaise. It's tough in terms of unemployment insurance. We have to remove certain services instead of increasing them. And the workers' movement has increased its demands. There are more and more right-wing nationalist parties. In many countries, like in Denmark and the UK, the employment market, the labor market is working well. We need simple, technical, pragmatic solutions. I'm not saying that I have the miracle solution, but one thing I've been thinking of since I've been mayor for the last 2 years. Prior to that, I was a general economist. As a mayor, you have to think about local democracy, how the local community works. You have to look at town planning. How should we design our countries? There's a lot of malaise in France. There have been riots and violence. A lot of these phenomena can be explained owing to these segregated northern districts where you only have immigrants and a certain group of people. In Sweden, huge low-cost housing units in the 60s and 70s were built for poor Finnish immigrants at the time. And in France, the same thing took place at the time of Le Corbusier. Well, Le Corbusier denoted great progress. However, we have created highly segregated neighborhoods in the outlying areas of towns. I have a very modest solution to propose. In our city, in Helsinki, we're trying to mix the population instead of having these segregated neighborhoods. We're trying to mix together the rich and the poor. That's how we're trying to plan our city. We want to have buildings where you have owner-occupants next to buildings where you just have tenants who receive a subsidy from the city or the state. We want to avoid at all costs any form of segregation in the city. It's not easy, of course, because people in open societies can move to live wherever they want. You can't be dictatorial. But when you draw up a plan for public spaces, one can have a lot of influence on the structure of society. And I believe that this is a very simple solution we could put forward. It's quite a practical, quite a simple solution, which might remedy this malaise which runs deep and is deeply ingrained in society today.
But it's not only true for Finland, it's also true for France. Thank you for these words. It sounds simple, but it's very complicated. Chloe, we just talked about the actors of democracy, the citizens, but you're talking about the politicians in your book. You're saying they need help, they are threatened, they are sick, their functions, no one else wants to exercise these functions anymore. Yes, you cannot talk about democracy if you don't talk about the people who activate it. And I'm not talking about only the citizens, but the elected authorities as well. But we know that these elected authorities are citizens, but the image of their function is more and more deteriorated. And the conditions in which they exercise their functions are being deteriorated. If you are locally elected, it means you are ill-paid for the time you spend helping others. You are submitted to a tyranny of transparency. You have to render accounts. You have to be accountable as to what your children do, what your companion does. And some of them are ill-treated. We've seen that with the mayor of L'Île-aux-Roses recently. They've been submitted to a lot of violence. And each elected authority receives almost on a daily basis some insults. But nevertheless, we need these people. We need them to make the decisions. We need the function to remain attractive, so as to have competent people, people who come from all fields of society, people who are connected and representative of what society can be. And at one point or another, we need to ask ourselves about the attractiveness of the function as an elected authority. Some elements are extremely positive elements have been introduced over the past 10 years to maintain the transparency of public life. The higher authority of public life is enabling now to approach the revenues, for example, of deputies, which wasn't the case in the past, but there are other elements that are negative. We have to think about the remuneration of these elected authorities, for example, the mayors of villages or cities from 1,000 to 50,000 inhabitants. They're not the same at all as what that person would be paid if they worked in a company, private company. And also, this has deprived the parliament of part of the people who made its diversity. And once again, there are good and bad elements. When a judge challenges a political decision that should be sanctioned by citizens, it is a dysfunctioning, a malfunction of democracy. We must also think about the usefulness of the publication of people's revenue, non-revenue. It's okay to make sure that people are not getting richer through their functions, but is it useful for us as citizens to know what is the brand of their car, or whether they have a holiday house in Brittany? And also, you have some professional elected authorities that are therefore cut off from society because they just hang on to their mandate and are no longer connected to real society. And we must absolutely apply the sanctions against the people who exert violence against these elected authorities, because sometimes now they complain in court, they go to the police, sometimes they don't even do it anymore because nothing is done to protect them. And when you attack a mayor, for example, you're attacking the citizens they represent, and it's absolutely not acceptable. Thank you. Two things we might pick up before we give the floor to the audience. First of all, the issue of the welfare state, which is very interesting. Marie-Lise Léon, do you have a feeling that our democracy since 1945, after the National Compact of, created after the war in 1945, is being threatened by by immigration, by all these new movements? Answer no. Well, very quickly I will say no. I think there are geopolitical tensions, different cultures, different societal projects with different visions of the world that are being confronted. And each side wants to impose to the others a given vision of an economic or democratic model or a social model. Now, this being said, we can defend the position of the state and the democracy by being open, especially inside our country, to the existence of democracies that need to articulate together. And giving this space, this intermediate space, means a reinforcement of democracy. And it might sound counterintuitive, but it's a way of reinforcing or strengthening the state. I was hearing about the upheavals and the need to strengthen social cohesion, but social cohesion to a large part rests on social stakeholders, social actors, people from civil society, associations, who represent this social cement, social link, and who need to be supported, comforted, and listened to. I believe that historically it is true that the welfare state, at least in the Nordic countries, was a result of globalization, because international free trade led to prosperity but also to uncertainty. And it means that people need to have a social security and social reassurance. But welfare state is threatened by democracy, because we will not have enough to fund all the public services with a great number of pensioners. Well, you were talking about what we call intermediate bodies, but very often in France you feel that you have the lower democracy, that of the trade unions, etc., but they have trouble talking to the democracy of the top, so to say. How did you feel that? How did you go from these discussions to political decisions from the top? Well, with Je m'engage pour l'Afrique, we want to get public policies that will lead to an excellent and well-performing Africa. I believe that the first thing you need are social media. How can you get the topic to emerge? The issue is to see how youngsters can take the floor. To me, it's important to create a path that works. But there's a lot of decisions being mentioned, but they don't usually come to fruition. So it's important to know who does what in the administrative system, because if you don't understand that, you won't know who you have to talk to, whom you should congratulate when you need congratulating someone. And in my opinion, when a citizen is committed, they need to get results for the community they're working for. So there's a need to really get to practical results. Chloe, in your previous book, you used to talk about political authorities who had trouble applying the political decisions because they were prevented by an extremely heavy administrative system. Would you say this is the issue? Yes, overall, when political authority announces something, and between that moment and the moment when it has a practical impact on the life of people, there's a huge deadline. And this obviously changes the decision. This time changes the decision and changes the vision that people have of the actual decision, because the results are lessened. But there is indeed a responsibility for political authorities, that of executing the decisions. I believe that a lot of them don't spend enough energy, enough time to make sure that the decisions are actually being implemented, because we have to be very careful about how law comes into place, how it is implemented, and in my opinion, this should take at least 90% of the time of these people, and it's not the case today. So I'm going to turn to the room for questions. Please, questions, not declarations, just questions in one sentence, so we can take as many as possible. Thank you. My question is quite easy. When you look at the figures concerning abstentions in the elections, one can wonder whether the problem is more citizens. It's easy to say all political authorities are rotten, but that's an easy answer and it may not be the actual problem. Who wants to answer that question about democracy is in the hands of citizens and it's for them to go and vote? Well, there's a huge responsibility of political authorities in the mistakes they made, but saying that they're all rotten is wrong. It's statistically, you have to know that most of the political authorities are not the ministers you see on TV, but the elected people who work in the various areas locally, and not voting is a way of not facing your responsibilities as citizens. I would like to remind you of the work, a very interesting note written by Vincent Pons in the file of Les Rencontres. Question. I wanted to turn to Mrs. Léon concerning a question on globalization. Personally, I have trouble believing that globalization is not a barrier, especially for the workers, because when you talk about relocation, about the migrant population that enables a reduction of the wages, this is not necessarily going in the right direction for French workers. I wanted to know why you don't think that globalization may be a problem for workers and for their rights. Okay, thank you. Globalization and social democracy, that's the question. Well, I believe that globalization may have brought a lot of progress in many countries and has helped some populations benefit from some social progresses. Now, it all depends on the way you regulate things. It's absolutely necessary to have the right tools, which may be different in 2023 than what they were in 2010 or in 2000. Globalization has changed. It has multiple faces, multiple aspects. But this is one of the challenges, one of the top challenges of international trade unions is to work against hidden work. When you take on an international vision as a trade unionist, you have to look at the reality of some other countries where things are extremely different from what they are in our country. And we may be involved in solidarity actions or in funding or helping and supporting trade unionists because they are threatened with a death sentence, for example, in some countries. So this has to be looked from the angle of the regulations that can be introduced and the tools that can be used. One of the tools we've been working on at length in 2017 in our trade union was the duty of vigilance. It's a form of international solidarity. How can we, in corporations, for example, identify the responsibility of the project owners and the subcontractors? It was the drama of Rana Plaza with the workers in the textile workers, where they were manufacturing T-shirts for French brands in disastrous conditions. Yes, and this law worked rather well for the textile industry. Yes, it did. The economic world yelled in 2017, saying it was a scandal having to regulate this type of connections. They said that a French company had no means to check the impact of what they did with the best of will. But we managed to convince the political stakeholders, and now those people who used to criticize are now saying at European level how happy they are that France was at the root of these regulations. I have a question about democracy in general. We talk a lot about democracy as a system to be reached, but don't you think we're not seeing a democracy as an ideal thing? We can try to explain this by saying that democracy is a value, but do you think that it should be an objective to impose democracy everywhere? Don't you think that we're looking at democracy with rosy lenses, really? Well, it might be the topic of a roundtable next year. Well, in 1 minute, I must say that we should export good models. And to me, democracy means responsibility and mobilization, making sure that things work, especially for the African continent. What I'm interested in is, do we manage to give jobs to those who need them? At the end of the day, can everybody have access to health care? And this is a priority for our youth, which is the future of our continent. We could spend hours saying this or that system is good or bad. But that's not the idea. The idea is to see that everyone should be able to find their right position in society. Thank you. Yes, it is interesting because we see this model is being challenged in many southern countries. So maybe I can ask our president to conclude this. Well, it's a bit frustrating because we didn't identify any miracle solution, but it seems that we need to involve citizens more in the democratic system, and we should try to encourage some of them to become candidates, encourage elected authorities to ask for new mandates, and we have to look at the status of these elected authorities. Many of you talked about the central role of debates or discussions in democratic life. In the final analysis, a democracy is not just a mathematical exercise where you count how many people are there, how many votes a given party can get. A democracy means also deliberating and talking and checking that things work properly. So we need this somewhat obsolete ingredient, which is the word discussion between various citizens, between various intermediary bodies. Marie-Lise, you mentioned the discussions that must take place between the social partners and the government. Ileana mentioned the importance of multiplying the areas of dialogue. If we want to increase the number of discussions concerning the planning, the land planning, we must involve populations of diverse origins. They must be able to get together and deliberate. In my work, I've looked a lot at that issue of discussions. These discussions are the ones that enable us to make our own opinion. Thanks to these discussions, we can get rid or reduce the fear of other groups that we may have. So above and beyond the remedies mentioned here, there is a role to be played by political parties to lead actions in the field to multiply or to these discussions with the people in the field. And I believe there's also a role to be played by companies and corporations. And I turn towards all of you who work in companies, because companies are one of the latest places where you can interact every day, when you have to respect people who have a different opinion from yours. Usually your neighbors, your friends, your family have the same opinion as you do. But when you get to your company, you can meet with people who can have a different opinion, and companies can be one of the places for these discussions. And I invite you to think in practical terms how you can encourage very respectful discussions to discuss.